introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker today and the principal sponsor of the event, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Social Innovation, Justine Munro, who I've just discovered is a recovering lawyer, but we won't blame her for that. Her centre is launching itself through a series of events, of which this is one, over the next day or two and the day before. So we hope it well set to sail into the future from the City of Sales, where it's based. Justine.
I guess one question at the very beginning is, what is a Centre for Social Innovation? What are you about? What do you do? Very simply, we're a vehicle for bringing together public, private and community partners to identify areas of pressing social need and create and accelerate the development of innovative solutions. In areas such as ageing, environmental services, youth crime, healthy living, we cover the full area, the full sort of spectrum of social needs, but by applying an innovation, discipline, and by bringing together a very cross-sectoral approach with a real focus on the outcomes, we aim to accelerate New Zealand's ability to quickly and rapidly innovate responses to the needs that we see in front of us. Without further ado, I'd like now to introduce the main act, Jeff Mulgan.
I'm going to talk about two chunks of things. One is the recession and how we respond to it. And I may be giving a slightly international perspective. I think it's still unclear exactly how the New Zealand economic situation relates to other parts of the world. And then I'll be talking about what that implies for this burgeoning field of social innovation and perhaps for some of the opportunities here. And I'm going to rattle through at a fair old pace. We're now a year into a deep economic crisis. Lots of opinions from the experts, most of whom got their analysis wrong again and again. The IMF told governments better to do too much than too little. They set various things like the guideline of 2% of GDP for stimulus. But as you go around the world, you see, I think that, as I've certainly never seen before, deep uncertainty about what the right thing to do is. I found this comment from Winston Churchill in 1930, the last time the world was in perhaps a similar point of the cycle, and he said, we're in a world where we now have no maps and our compasses are broken. And as I say, I sometimes feel that may be the case. And here I offer, not mine, but the best definition I've heard, the difference between a depression and a recession, that a depression is a recession where the policies don't work. And as I say, it's in the balance now in many countries whether we are in a recession or a depression. So, what's been done around the world? Again, I won't sort of labour these points, everything from subsidised credit for small firms, bailouts of mainly the car industries, countries like the UK delaying repossession of homes to try and alleviate the worst impacts. We've had an extraordinary range of stimulus packages around the world, some not working at all, like sales tax cuts in some countries, enormous emphasis in some places on green jobs. Korea, about a third of their package focused on the environment. San Francisco putting in place an infrastructure for electric cars. Big emphasis on health in the US, as well as green jobs. School buildings in Australia, the cabinet actually specifying detailed designs for what school buildings should be built. And in France, of course, cathedrals. The French being highly civilised people, as well as canals. And I'm sure they'll be introducing, as America in the 30s, special programs for publicly funded artists to roam the country. Everywhere, extending education to keep the unemployment numbers down. And so an interesting otherwise, like Korea has introduced a very large scheme for extending internships for students. The key thing for governments now is to sort of cope with the immediate crisis, but above all to focus on the long-term priorities for reform, what will need to change to lay the foundations for the next wave of growth, not fixing the problems of the last few years, whether it's the banks or the car industry. And if you ask which are the sectors which are most likely to generate jobs in the next 10 or 20 years, they are not cars, steel, ships, or even retail. The biggest growth will come in sectors like health and care, environmental services, and so on. Every serious forecast, certainly the bigger OECD countries, shows these as the major jobs creators, value creators, and so on. Now this may seem obvious, but it's almost the precise opposite of what most governments are doing. Nearly all their money is going into old industries, traditional ones, and into concrete. Now I want to turn to, in some ways, a very different set of issues, but I hope you'll see how they connect, which is the whole question of social innovation. And as highlights in 30 seconds each, four very simple messages which we've concluded. One is that again and again, innovation comes, we think, from what we slightly cornerly call connecting the Bs, the small groups, the individuals, the entrepreneurs who have the ideas, the energy, the insight, and the trees, the big organisations with power and money and roots and so on. Secondly, that the growth of ideas always depends on some combination of what we call effective supply, making the idea really work, really cost effective, really proven, and effective demand, someone to pay for it. And again, most ideas don't grow because they don't really deal with one or other side of that equation. Thirdly, that most histories of social innovation, when you look at them, they involve ideas moving across sectoral boundaries. Some of the most interesting ones in health or the environment actually begin in the household, in sort of informal life, before they then sometimes move into becoming a charity or a small organisation, and then perhaps becoming a business or perhaps moving into the state. Nearly all of our institutions and funds are single sector funds and are therefore wholly ill-suited to this dynamic cross-sectoral flow. And then finally, we become more and more obsessed with methods and with the idea that methods matter, just as they do in science and medicine, and yet this is a field which is very weak on methods. Much of this, in a way, is, I think, about reviving one of Roosevelt's sort of comments from 70 years ago, in the midst of the last great economic downturn, when he said it's common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something. And he showed that as a political leader, you could actually get away with innovation, experiment and risk, so long as you had a clear view of why you were trying to achieve it, and you tried as far as possible to mobilise all the capacities of your society to try and make things better.